years since I've spoke to this society. I feel like it may have been right before COVID. So a lot's happened. Obviously the program continues to push on with this very ambitious goal of repatriating 1 million of our lost Florida native orchids back into the landscapes and public spaces of South Florida. So we've kind of done this a non-traditional look at conservation. Conservation through propagation. So one of the few things we hope to get out of this is that by propagating things in large numbers, we can do a few things. One, we can indirectly destroy the black market for these native orchids in particular. So things that are what drives the value and the impetus and the drive for these people to get out, the motivation for them to get out to the Fakahatchee and cut a limb or go out to the Everglades and steal an orchid is the rarity and exclusivity. Once we provide these to the general public, we can grow and growing them in a sustainable way, and orchids are quite amenable to that, as you guys know, because they produce so many darn seeds. We can now decrease that value, that black market value for these things. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of our municipal partners hate when I say that. I'd much rather them go to Miracle Mile and take one out where there's 1,000 of them growing, again, than going to the Everglades and cutting a limb off a tree for an orchid. So I think there's a lot of value into thinking about conservation in a different way. With that said, there's 3 pillars which also make it very different than what we normally do in conservation, and I'm the first to admit, typically conservation takes place deep in the jungle somewhere with a small team of scientists, hidden from folks, right, in these protected areas, doing conservation with buffer zones and all of this stuff going on, where people really aren't engaged or aware of even what's happening, the important work we're doing. So this actually flips that on its head, and we're targeting, we also help the natural areas, but also mostly targeting, particularly from the Million Orchid Project, exclusively targeting public spaces. Places where people work, live, play, learn, as you'll see, starting with our schools, most importantly, and now every municipality pretty much in South Florida. The other is, again, it's exclusively driven by the public and community. Every single orchid is being grown either by a volunteer or a student. I have no paid technicians that grow the orchids in the lab. It's all a massive army of dedicated volunteers now who have been with us since the very first seeds dropped at Fairchild back in 2012. And then finally, again, this idea of targeting public spaces. So with that said, we'll talk a little bit about the Orchid Project, but first a little bit more about Fairchild. So based on the enthusiasm of the Million Orchid Project, Fairchild has really dedicated a lot of resources now to orchids. Obviously they're immensely popular, but for many years doing the Million Orchid Project, we're doing big orchid gardens in Lincoln Road, for instance. People would be like, oh, this is amazing, but how come when I go to Fairchild I never see any orchids? Well, we didn't really have much of a history with orchids outside of a few plants, well, several plants in our greenhouse, a collection. And like most botanic gardens, these would flower in a pot. All of a sudden it would appear in the collection in bloom, and then it would disappear back to the greenhouse for the rest of, while it was still green and until it bloomed maybe the next year. So Fairchild really thought about really investing into this group of plants. We did some polling, and it's really, this is what people want to see at botanic gardens, are things like orchids, color. And so that's when we established a National Orchid Garden. And again, like the Million Orchid Project, very experimental, a big natural experiment, where we're actually doing something very different. Rather than stashing all these orchids in the greenhouse, which we do with some of our delicates, we're actually permanently attaching or permanently trying to grow these out into the garden. So again, the Sobralia growing in the ground, something you wouldn't see anywhere else really. Bulbophyllums in the trees, Paphiopedilums now establishing in the grounds in the sunken garden. So trying to push the envelope on what we can curate and grow outdoors in a semi-natural context. So when you come to orchids, to see orchids at Fairchild, you're going to be looking up or in the ground. And unfortunately, the show isn't always on because orchids, once they're out, Mother Nature takes its course. So people are like, oh, they're expecting kind of very Singapore, National Orchid Garden, where there's these very, displays that are ephemeral. They just get replaced every night in some cases to keep the show going. But you'll always see something different when you come to Fairchild. There'll be a different group of orchids flowering or something interesting. And today, again, tens of thousands. We put out this, probably getting closer to 50 after this season. Last check in the database, about 400 species and varieties that are permanently growing into the collection. And again, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands in our propagation at the greenhouse, and millions in the lab. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And with the Million Orchid, just like what we do at the garden, it's all done with volunteers who are building these displays. So you'll never know. And again, you get big shipments of orchids, and their job is to build kind of these beautiful displays and get them curated out in the collections. And with a unique focus, in particular, what I'm interested in is orchids of the Caribbean. And we'll talk a little bit about that and kind of this new direction we're looking at in terms of the Million Orchid Project and orchids in landscapes. So things like the ghost orchids are growing in very large numbers, and actually we've now established at least 3 of the ghost orchid species in the genus Dendrophylax, including our native Florida ghost and the hybrid, which is a winner. We always want to promote this hybrid. Some of you guys may not know there's actually a hybrid working on. It's a cross between our Florida ghost orchid, Denii, and it's crossed with Dendrophylax salii from the Dominican Republic. And you'll see this is actually the hybrid right here. You get actually get a bigger flower, which is better for most people, but it still has that ghost orchid form. But what you really get is the hybrid vigor. And so what we found with this particular cross is with that hybrid vigor, it's not as hard to grow. It grows quicker, more robustly, and most importantly, it's not as sensitive to water quality. One of the big issues with the native Florida orchid, it really prefers either rainwater or RO, adding just trace nutrient to establish. We've killed a lot of these, chlorinated water will kill a ghost orchid very quickly. So we're really happy to see the hybrid doing well, and also orchids of Cuba. So we now, we'll talk a little about that. We now acquired, with the help of a friend of the garden, Claude Hamilton. When he retired, we were able to purchase and acquire a lot of his collection, which we're now propagating. And he probably has the most comprehensive collection of Cuban and Caribbean species on the planet. And these are going to be, again, as you'll see, these are going to be our landscape plants of the future. But the Million Orchid Project, we can't take all the credit for the concept. It actually started on the other side of the planet, in a place I'm lucky enough to go every year and work with my colleagues. This is Singapore. And for those that aren't familiar with Singapore, it's one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, a small island nation off Malaysia. And what Singapore had, the vision they had done about 30, 40 years ago, is they purposely, with the help of the Botanic Garden playing the lead role with the government, they purposely transformed basically this kind of rundown port island into the greenest city on the planet, complete with its own botanic garden in the airport, the Shanghai Jewel, which is spectacular. Also, their botanic gardens are world class. Gardens by the Bay is an amazing place to be able to work and work with the colleagues there and learn how to improve our collections. And if you've been to Singapore, you'll see everything is biophilic. So this is one of the hotels. All the buildings not only are covered in green, but it's actually mandated by the government that every developer has to incorporate a biophilic design and use plants as part of their overall building concepts. And it's absolutely spectacular. So with that said, and kind of piggybacking on the enthusiasm and this idea of the Million Orchid Project being so well received in the area, we've now kind of started 2 new initiatives at the garden. One is called the City in the Garden. And as components of those, we're now working on the Million Balcony Project. We're actually growing lines of balcony plants. So the idea is getting the barbecue grills and bicycles, maybe less of those, and providing plants which can tolerate everything from salt in the air all the way to these hot arid, it's much hotter and drier on balconies in South Florida. But you can imagine the instant impact if all the high-rises downtown had plants on their balcony instead of the barbecue grill, right? Or the chair sunbathing. It would be an instant impact without having to get too involved with infrastructure and permitting to build on buildings. That's a whole nother ball of wax, which we're not trained for. That's landscape architects and people that do that work. But just as something as simple as providing people with plants they can grow on their balconies can really transform the way we look at the city. And also that all leads into human health and well-being and green spaces. And really, a lot of my job now is getting out into the community, working with these developers, working with these municipalities to think about how we can try to really make big impacts in the city and using the community to drive that work. But anyway, real reason we go to Singapore and how it relates to the Million Orchid Project is to visit this National Orchid Garden, which I mentioned, a world-class orchid garden, if not the best, dedicated to orchids. And we made a trip back in 2010 when I was still a graduate student when we were building our new Damari Science Villages. So one of the labs that was going to be built in the village was a micropropagation lab, an orchid lab essentially, to do this type of work. And so we wanted to see how Singapore was doing it, because again, they're kind of one of these ideal models for this type of work. And so this is what you typically see in a micro propagation lab or a culture room, in vitro culture. All these bottles full of plantlets, right? Each one of these bottles contain hundreds, if not thousands of little plantlets, and all kind of on these grow lights. It's kind of a very intriguing look, right? And it actually captures people's attention. And what we really loved how it was forward-facing. Most botanic gardens, which I work at several of them with colleagues, the science and research is hidden. It's in some building, you usually don't even know where it is. I pulled up many times to visit someone, like, where's the research building? You know, you're wandering around the collections and it's in the back somewhere, and even at Q, it's in the back somewhere and hidden off. But we wanted the lab not only be forward-facing, but publicly accessible, something also very different. So it's not ordinary for me or my to be pipetting in the DNA lab and a visitor walks in right in the middle of doing an extraction and asks you, hey, what are you doing? Or a group of kids come in. And you know, all my graduate students that work for us, they all know that's part of the deal. You have to be able to communicate your science to any of the visitors and to be able to use the resources. So that's kind of the idea. But really, most importantly, one of the questions we get asked is, if you have all these like tens and hundreds of thousands of plantlets, what's the fate of all these plants? This seems to be well beyond the needs of conservation initiatives on the island, or for the garden collection, or maybe a little commercial for the gift shop. And to our surprise, they were handing off their excess plants to their public works officials, in this case, the national parks. So the national parks of Singapore run all of their green spaces. I joke, but things get done, authoritarian, more money than any other country, and things get done in Singapore, but hopefully we can work around things in Miami. It's a little more complex. But they were handing these plants off. Some of my colleagues were much younger in those days, and we were shocked because it really works. If you go to Singapore now, this is the only data I'll bore you with, but the point of this is you can see that, for instance, some of these plantings on Holland Road, survivorship was even sometimes higher than in a natural area, but it was comparable. It was not significantly different. So it really changed the way we started thinking about how resilient are these plants. You know, we typically think of orchids being very sensitive to even microhabitat changes, kind of the canaries in the coal mine of ecosystem health. But we're finding that many of these orchids are much tougher and more adaptable than we had ever thought, which is really encouraging because, you know, with climate change and all the things we're seeing, they're going to have to, it's not always the case, but a lot of them actually are. And this is what you see nowadays in Singapore. No big deal, just bulbophyllums just all on the trees everywhere. It's insane. Dermatophyllum, the queen of all orchids, the world's largest orchid, just growing on the side of the road. Again, no big deal in Singapore. It's just over the top.
Wow.
We actually have one of these at the garden, a few of these in the garden in flower this year, and actually brought a lot of attention. So the one, again, it's the largest orchid species on the planet in terms of biomass. There's a 300-year-old specimen in Singapore that's at least 3 or 4 meters in diameter. It can be up to 25 feet tall with the spikes and the canes. It almost looks like sugar cane. They get so massive. But again, the flowers like the size of a dinner plate. We actually were able to hand pollinate this one with pollen from Naples Botanic Garden. There's bloomed as well. And the seed capsules are like a banana. There's probably upwards of 20 million seeds in that bloom, you can estimate it. But we thought, why not Miami, right? Immediately. We have this new lab coming, we have this amazing urban metropolis, and we had our own host of native species, right, that grow here in South Florida. To put it in perspective, you know, you're looking at about 200 or so species in all of North America. This doesn't include Mexico. It jumps up another 1,400 roughly species when you add Mexico. About half of all these 200 are in our backyard, are in Florida. And about a quarter, a little over a quarter, are within, you know, a half-hour drive of us here in South Florida. And this really lends itself to this unique blend of temperate and tropical species that coalesce right here in southern Florida. So we get species that come up from the north and just make it to the south, and then we get these Caribbean taxa that make it just up in the extreme southern tip of Florida. And that includes our epiphytic orchids. So epiphytes are those orchids that grow on trees, most of the ones you see here today. And you'll see the epiphytes will drop out once you get past like Gainesville. You'll get maybe a couple species, but really the lion's share right in our backyard, making this area an orchid hotspot and a great place to be an orchid biologist. I do say so. Oh, you guys are orchid people. This one got left in, but so you're looking at about 52 genera, 100 or so species in Florida. But what's really neat is about roughly 50% of these are comprised of a single species that just, again, usually of tropical origin, New World tropicals, Caribbean, that just week up in the South Florida, and things you would never imagine, things like Boliphyllum, which is now extirpated. We actually had a Boliphyllum native to Florida, Boliphyllum pachygrachus, or the rat-tailed orchid. It's one that's been on my wish list for decades now, and it grows in Cuba, but the last plant was documented in the 70s by Dr. Lure. Macrotania lutescens, another tropical genera you won't see really anywhere else. But really it's a testament to, again, this kind of being part of the Caribbean floristic region. So it's important that I tell people, especially out of town, it really blows their mind that South Florida, we actually share most of our plants in common with the Caribbean. So we have more plants in common with Bahamas and Cuba than we do with Orlando. And our own charismatic species, near and dear to my heart, and I studied for many years, our Certipodium punctatum, our cigar orchid, largest orchid in North America. It's our giant. These can reach 2 meters in diameter, and we have several large ones at the garden and a natural population even there. But also things like our Florida butterfly orchid, our most abundant orchid historically. So you guys can still find these in this neighborhood, but unfortunately, these plants we're talking about were completely extirpated from the urban landscapes. To put in perspective, we've never found an orchid, a native orchid, in a tree at any of our sites we've planted in. We always look to see if maybe we'll see a butterfly orchid, but we've never found one on any site. And why did this happen? How did we get to this situation? It all started with scenarios like this back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The world was undergoing this orchid delirium, they called it. Basically, there was this race to get all these tropical orchids. A lot of times they make, before us, they made their way back to Kew or somewhere in the UK. Again, as this kind of symbol of wealth and opulence. But it also happened right here in South Florida. So when Flagler built the railroad connecting the Northeast to South Florida, the early accounts is that the trees were dripping in orchids. And this was the situation that took place nearly immediately because they were so readily available. As I've done some sleuthing as an amateur historian on this stuff, and I'm a firm believer that orchids may have been the very first resource coming out of South Florida even before the cypress timber, because they were just everywhere. I mean, wagon loads after wagon loads. These are the Trichocentrum undulatum, our mule-eared orchid. I worked with that one in the Everglades. There's 40 plants left, and we had a 30% decline last year. So it's one that's on its way out. Don't worry, we've done about 20,000 with 6th and 7th graders the last 2 years. They're secure, but unfortunately, this is the Florida genetics. We're still trying to work with the Everglades to get some things going. Easier said than done. Things like our cowhorn orchid, that cigar orchid again, epidendrums. And this happened wagon load after wagon load, burlap sack after burlap sack, filled to the brim. Some of these plants, decades old, hard to estimate. And they love when I show this, my bosses, but that's David Fairchild's wife right there in the white dress, with her giant armful of epidendrums. In all fairness, back in those days, they were probably so abundant, they may have thought they were kind of this inexhaustible resource. Essentially, these plants would make their way on that railroad, end up in a flower shop in Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, the DuPont mansion on the dinner table. After it was done blooming, it was pitched in the garbage. Yeah. So, how can we get to 1 million orchids? We have to talk a little orchid biology, but you guys are all orchid files, so hopefully you'll be interested in this. This is not an orchid. This is the bean plant we're all familiar with, right? And I'm Melissa, the teacher. The classic germination experiment. You slap some beans in a wet paper towel, put it in the drawer, open it up in 2 days, voila, they germinated. And the reason that is because of the unique organelle inside of the seed. So what comprises the majority of a typical seed, if you will, is the endosperm. It's a botanical term, but it's essentially a food reserve that's built for the little tiny embryo which is in that seed. So it's the first sugar or carbon source or energy it takes to kick out those first roots and those first little leaves, and then they begin to undergo photosynthesis and our typical plant behavior, right? Oh yeah, in the case of the coconut, they even got water. It's like the perfect seed, right? So we like to say, with orchids, it's different. We like to say their mom didn't pack them a lunch. They are the smallest, this is how they're born. Slides are a bit out of order, but we'll work with it. This is a seed capsule, or a fruit, if you will, as a kind of a layman term. But in this capsule can contain tens of thousands, if not millions, of tiny dust-like seeds. So these seeds are microscopic, typically under 1 millimeter in size, and they're a simple seed type, or a naked seed, where essentially you have this case called a testa, the seed coat, airspace, and that's the little embryo, that's the baby plant. And there's no food. There's nothing that sparked to initiate germination. There's no energy source. So, as you can imagine, in the old times, people, when they come in all shapes and sizes, just like the flowers. In the old times, you know, they would sprinkle these seeds and, you know, somewhere in Kew maybe on pots of different media and nothing would ever happen. And for years and years, they couldn't figure it out. Until some dear friends, and actually I'm happy to say Rasmussen's, they discovered that they couldn't figure out what happened. And so eventually they found out, well, how the heck are these guys doing this in the wild? Well, what they found is that all orchids, so there's more orchids than any other plant, arguably. Some people say the sunflower family, but I'm biased towards orchids. But every single species on the planet requires a fungus to germinate. And these are called mycorrhizae. These are beneficial fungus. And so you can see here, the hyphae, kind of, so most time fungus is this microscopic hair-like structures that are in the soil or growing on everything. But when they encounter a seed, they'll actually begin to penetrate the seed. So there's some cue, which we're not really sure of yet, that the orchid seed has, to cause these little hair-like structures to penetrate the seed. And what they do is they actually digest the fungus. So most of the time when plants work with these fungi, they give the fungi back sugar and other things, and the fungus helps them take up water and gives them some nutrients. Well, in the case of orchids, there's no evidence they do that. So orchids are actually predators or parasites on fungus when they begin life. Bizarre, right? Because we're all taught plants are autotrophs, right? They make their own food via photosynthesis. So all my young students, they can outsmart their teacher in biology maybe and be like, not so fast, teach. In the case of orchids, they're actually heterotrophic at this stage. They feed like an animal. Totally bizarre. And this is, you can see there's no chlorophyll. They're completely white. So they're feeding exclusively, preying on fungus. Pretty cool, but I'm biased. Eventually the leaf litter will, and a lot of these fungi are actually the mushroom-forming group. So a lot of my research as a PhD was working with finding out what orchids, usually it's fungi, where those fungi are in the environment. And a lot of them actually are in the mushroom-forming groups. And over time, maybe the soil will break apart in the leaf litter, or the branch will open up a little bit for the sun. UV will begin to make contact with the little protoform, these little swelled seeds, and it'll start to produce the pigments, as you can see here, and start making little roots and little seedlings, and eventually begin to emerge as what we would think is a typical plant. But you can imagine how rare that event is. What are the chances you blow from, we should actually share a couple orchids from West Africa. You go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, what are the chances you land on just the right tree on mushroom? Exceedingly rare. So maybe 1% we think in nature for most orchids. 1% to 5% is actually good for a lot of orchid species. That's why they produce so many. That's the strategy. But again, you can imagine this was never a feasible way to grow orchids in large numbers, because the chances of you, especially 100 years ago, finding the fungus, the right fungus, having the seed and adding them and growing orchids for production was never a possibility until around the 1940s, when a gentleman, Merishiki, found that if you add essentially sugar directly to the seed, you can germinate nearly 100% of it. And again, we've gotten a lot more complex than that time back in the 1940s. And we can add plant growth hormones and different mineral salts and all these other additives, which we do with the students as part of the research they drive. But it all comes in this form of this nutrient agar, which is kind of this black stuff. The black is from activated carbon, charcoal in there, which acts as a chemical sponge. It takes up particularly waste products the orchids produce, which can kill them over time. And with these methods, these lab methods, because this has to be done in a sterile lab, because the sugar, that rich sugar solution, also will attract microbes. If you leave an open banana on the table, it's going to be moldy overnight, right? Well, the same principle applies with this sugar-rich medium. So everything has to be done in sterile conditions. In a sterile laminar flow hood, basically a sterile workspace. All your instruments are sterilized like a surgery or a microbiology lab. So these techniques were thought to be very specialized and things that regular people shouldn't do maybe, but weren't capable of doing. But again, we kind of flipped that on its head, and we started out with that gentleman there, dear friend, my mentor, Dr. Motes, and our first volunteers in our orchid lab to see if we could teach regular person how to do this type of laboratory work. And what Martin's really great at is distilling down things that are quite complex into things that are more like DIY, or more friendly and recognizable to regular people. So, rather than using, big cylinders and big pipetters, we use labels, which measure the right amount. Rather than using these old French squares we started with, we now use deli containers, which are recyclable and reusable, and we can repurpose much easier. But what we found is we can take a person about a half hour, as young as we've done with 6, 7-year-olds, about a half hour, and they can propagate orchids in the laboratory. And many of these ladies are still with me to the day, and in their 90s in some cases. And Stephanie with her perfect hair, she actually just moved up north. We lost Stephanie, but Stephanie Foreman was one of our original veterans. And pretty much overnight, we began to produce orchids. So a little orchid math for you. 1 fruit or seed capsule, we're talking tens of thousands, millions of seeds, become 10 mother flasks, all chock full of little germinates, maybe 10,000 in one bottle or container. They outgrow that container after a few months, 150, that turns into 250, it's exponential. So very quickly, it's not can you grow orchids, it's what the hell do you do with all these orchids? It becomes a square footage issue. And this was our lab pretty much within the first year, chock full of orchids, thousands upon thousands. At this point, we were setting up grow racks in anybody's office who had a plug. I was blowing fuses all in the science lab, burning up control panels. It was pretty wild. This is before we had LEDs, so this is about 10 years ago. But we were growing orchids. We were essentially in the orchid conservation business really quickly. And this was our situation at the greenhouse at Montgomery. Patrick's here, where we house all the orchids, again managed by, this endless flood is all managed by volunteers. We teach how to grow the orchids, but often bring their own expertise and have been growing orchids longer than I've been alive. So it's great to have this knowledge base that we can tap in to orchid societies like yourself, and even grow them in innovative ways like our bioreactor system, which is kind of the latest and greatest system where you're using liquid media to grow orchids. And it's automated. I can control it from my phone to feed them and drain them. It's really cool. As we're building our new zero extinction lab, our new laboratory facility, we're going to actually have 2 bioreactors and 12 laminar flow hoods that we now can offer courses in micropropagation and tissue culture, which don't exist, believe it or not, really in the Western Hemisphere outside of a few academic institutions that create a little, closed session essentially to train people. So I'm really excited about, getting the tissue culture person in soon. Not just orchids, we're growing woodies, all these different types of plants, and actually being able to create courses that we can cross this with the universities and also people in the industry to learn how to do this work. And again, can't even count all my volunteers or recognize them all, but some of you guys are here. But we're talking hundreds of volunteers over the last 10 years or so. So we started with a handful of our Florida natives, particularly selecting ones that we thought were going to be hardy, and also tend to grow in either drier or more kind of, drier habitat type, so things that we think can tolerate kind of this urban landscape, as we'll talk about, which tend to be much hotter and drier than the adjacent natural areas. It's called the urban heat island effect. It's something we're studying with these orchids right now in the schools. But it's real and it's quite profound, as you'll see. But things like our Encyclia tempensis, our little butterfly orchid, which is by far the one we grow the most of because it's the one that's historically most common, but it's just a hardy, tough little orchid, can grow in a number of situations, from a mangrove swamp all the way to a pineland on the west coast. That species actually will get up to nearly the northern boundary, close to like kind of that Ocala area, is kind of where you'll start seeing them fall out. So they have a broad range, and so they're going to be suitable as we expand the Million Orchid Project footprint northward. And it's just a tough little, pretty little orchid. It grows fast, blooms early, everything you want in an orchid. So things like our rare orchids, super rare orchids, like of course our cowhorn orchid, maybe 100 plants left in the largest population. Oncidium insatum, which is a ground orchid, so we also grow 4 or 5 different ground orchids, terrestrial orchids. So Oncidium insatum is the species I brought you guys today to distribute. Also state threatened, should be listed on endangered soon. We're working on that. Maybe 200 plants left or so, I think, in the last survey where we find them. Really rare, but it's just a great, tough little orchid. And a lot of people don't know we have our own native dancing lady, right? We always think of the spatulatums and the ones from Central and South America, but we have our own native Oncidium, which is even cooler to me. Our little dollar orchid, Trichocentrum undulatum, the mule-eared, again, state federally endangered, 40 plants left. Vanillas are another thing we're having a lot of fun with, including our Vanilla deloniana, or Mary Lott's vanilla, recorded and collected only one time, we know, in Florida on the Miami River. And interesting story with that particular vanilla, was collected on the Miami River, and it was rediscovered, I guess, in someone's backyard here in like South Miami or kind of in this neighborhood. And we thought it was extirpated, and so this single plant has now created a line of clones and divisions, which we're now passing and distributing and growing in very large numbers. And also they have aromatic properties, which we're really interested in. So kind of just another kind of side mission and dream off the Million Orchid is thinking about, I was working with the University of Florida to develop our own line of Miami vanilla. So using our native vanilla, which are aromatic, 3 or 4 of the species have potential to make the commercial vanilla, and creating new flavor profiles like wine, I guess you can do with vanilla, since it's the second highest spice in terms of its market value behind saffron. It's pretty amazing, the industry. It's multi-billion-dollar around the world. A single bean of some of this really high-quality vanilla can go for a couple $100. A single bean. So you can imagine if we could develop some of these new flavor profiles, we could send these to Brooklyn to the hipster bakeries and charge an arm and a leg and drive conservation. And what's also cool is they're tough plants. You can grow them in nearly full sun, and you don't need to have, you can essentially grow these in 5-gallon buckets in a parking lot. So imagine if we were able to get in some of these urban areas that are either vacant parking lots, browns fields, and be able to turn them into vanilla cultivation centers, which could infuse some income into those communities. But these are all types of squirrely things we're doing. Of course, the ghost orchid, our shade loving epidendrum nocturnum is another one we grow in large numbers. We also have about 10 other species we're working on now, and a whole new line which we'll talk about. So you thought about the square footage issue. Immediately we had to think about how to extend our lab, and we did that through the schools. So the first year of the program, we had over 100 schools doing the program, tens of thousands of students, all back in those days, looking at different media combinations, like what additives perform best for each of the species. When we started the program, we had no idea how to grow these native species. Most of them did not have a protocol. They didn't have any specialized blend. We had to use kind of a generic formula and see how they behave. But now I'm happy to say we now have species-specific blends, many of which have been published for most of our native orchids, which we share with other people doing this conservation work. You can see that one's good and that one's bad. And they grew them out. Back in those days, we colored them with food coloring for the different treatments. But again, students are doing authentic research using these orchids. The curriculum took a long time for me to develop, and it all fits with the pacing guide and the Sunshine State standards, which are not easy because they change like every hour, it feels like. Because we don't want to put more work on teachers. We want to be able to almost seamlessly try to integrate the plants into their coursework. So rather than counting something arbitrary, they're counting the orchid, right, or measuring orchids. So we really think a lot about that and how we can make it reproducible all around the nation. Eventually they'll come out of their little containers. They outplant them into their, acclimate them, harden them off in their little greenhouse domes on their little growth racks, which convert into little greenhouses, we call them the botany lab. And they grow them out. And you can see, for instance, this is that cigar orchid we're talking about. 100 plants left in Fakashi. Each one of these containers, maybe 30, 40, 50 plants. That's 200 plants at a single school. Extrapolate that over 105 schools. That's conservation happening at a scale we hadn't really ever seen before. So I worked with this one in the Fakashi. It took us 7 years. Fairchild, Atlanta Botanic, and FIU. It took us 7 years to do 2,500 plants. We can do tens of thousands in a single year with helpers. So using crowdsourcing the conservation, right? Getting the community involved, we can scale up our conservation, we can scale up our capacity. And we can beautify the cities, right? Because our landscapes, because the fate of all these orchids is their schoolyards or their communities. And we do that at the end of each school year. And we have a lot of fun with it. Media is going in and getting plants in kids' hands. There's nothing more important to us at Fairchild than that. And some schools kind of take it to another level. We have an amazing school in Hialeah, which actually has the first established ghost orchid on its campus. Our amazing teacher, Andy Kearns, some of you may know him. He's been featured on the news a lot. He's just an amazing guy. But they actually have ghost orchids established on their campus. So and they look amazing. They're better than anything we have growing in the garden. You never know. So hopefully that flowers is going to bring a lot of attention. But also, Hialeah being the least diverse city in America. It's predominantly Cuban, like 90%. They were really interested in Cuban orchids, and so she's hand pollinated the Cuban Encyclia Phoenicia, the chocolate orchid, the Cuban chocolate orchid. So they have like their own little special Cuban conservation going on, which they take part of. But it wasn't enough for us, again, to address this kind of lack of botany in schools. A few years ago, I can't remember now, time flies so fast, probably 6, 7 years ago, the state dropped plant science from the curriculum. Yeah, not important, really. I mean, it's pretty wild. So in addition to us trying to lobby, I remember writing letters with some folks to try to not make this happen. We did. So our response to that was to get our own high school working with Miami-Dade Public Schools. We worked to create and establish the biotech at Richmond Heights. These students completed their own textbook, which we worked on, and they had a whole lab at their school. You can see the 2 laminar fluids, which now 6 students at one time growing orchids. And they can take on more in-depth projects like hand pollination, collecting wild fruit set, seed bulking, and a lot of them take part in our seed banking project with our cooperation with the Smithsonian and our partnership with NAOP. And the goal is to bank all of our native orchids of the United States and their compatible fungus. So we have the biggest job with half the orchids in the country, and 50% of them in our backyard. So our students each year, the cohorts are trained to receive seeds from either myself or other researchers, get them dried, processed, cleaned, weighed, accessioned. We even we're looking at seed anatomy and how they respond to banking. We bank them in multiple temperatures, send them to the Millennial Seed Banks, send them to Smithsonian, all done by kids. And I think they've banked, we probably have banked 400 different 40 species and probably 400 different populations. So the population genetics are also important in banking. So this is something that's great because when you have this new cohort every year, a new group of students get trained up and they can pull things out of the fridge that have been there 10 years and get really great long-term data. Things that are very difficult to do even in academia, just to keep these long-term projects going. But again, we had to adapt, trying to find a way to have everyone do every aspect of the orchid propagation. And so, as you can imagine, none of the schools are like biotech where they have a micropropagation laboratory, a sterile laboratory facility, so we had to find a way to bring the lab to them. And a lot of you are familiar with our STEM lab, this time bringing in another group of students, a bit older. These were senior architect students from the University of Miami. And we gave them, the joke is, the least sterile thing on the planet, a decommissioned school bus from Miami-Dade Public Schools. And their task was to turn this into a fully functional replica of the laboratory we had. And so over the course of 3 months, that's all they had as a summer kind of project for them before they graduated. They gutted this thing. It was a billow of dust came out of this thing. They opened the door. I was like, panicked. And sure enough, they gutted this thing over a month, ran millions of miles of wire. The mole, we called him, he ran wire. He was under the bus all summer. They don't make laminar flow hoods for buses. I checked. We checked many times. So all of those had to be custom built, frames, slowly comes together, complete with autoclave, RODI water. It's it's solar and biodiesel generated. And again, we get the pros, you get the form and the function. So it's absolutely kind of a work of art in itself with laser etching to adorn it. And this is what it looks like now. It's got a lot of attention. We're now in our, I think this is year 11 of STEM Lab, believe it or not. And some of our teachers who have participated are here, and it's a lot of fun, and it's shockingly clean and efficient. I am still blown away by our contamination levels. Remember, if one little germ or spore gets into the process, it's ruined. They'll outgrow the plant, thriving on that rich sugar that's in that medium. And these students will roll in. We visit 70 visits a year, and probably upwards of close to 2,000 students depending on the class sizes, and we can generate nearly 20,000 plants a year alone on STEM Lab. Again, this last 2 years they've been working on that mule year, and we just are overrunning mule year orchids now, which is great. It comes along with a whole set of curriculum on orchid conservation, biology, plant biology, and it's a lot of fun and super charismatic. We're now, she's getting a bit long in the tooth. We're already thinking about 2.0 down the road. Maybe an RV or something like that, which we have a little bit more flexibility with moving. Unfortunately, the bus is still property of Miami-Dade Public Schools, They furnish the drivers the deal. We kind of own everything on the inside. So we're not allowed to leave the county line. So all my friends at Broward, or Bonnet House, or Flamingo can't bring it. My colleagues at Smithsonian, my lab at Smithsonian can't bring it to the mall. So hopefully with the new version, we can get kind of an RV situation, don't need commercial license, that we can take all around the nation potentially to get people propagating orchids. And we also tried to find other ways to bring the lab to them. In this case, we were somewhere up north, and one of my former graduate students now at FIU, Nicole, and I took these little air clean systems, which are also little sterile hood systems, really designed for DNA work, but they work fine for propagating orchids. The little kids can come and have fun. Folks like you can bring in seeds they have been wanting to germinate, trying to find a lab, and we can help you with that type of work. Another project that happened shortly after STEM Lab, again, the other missing component was shade houses, or where do you harden these things? The little greenhouse domes are fine, but what do you do over summer, right? You either had to come and retrieve the plants if they weren't big enough to get outplanted, or we just had to risk it and put young plants out knowing we'll see losses. So we had to find a way. Again, we reached out to our friends at University of Miami and said, Jim, we need a shade house. And we're going to give you this crazy laundry list of things that are completely outrageous and see what you can do. Most importantly, it has to fit in a teacher's car, of all things, right? And they came up with this little shade house, the Million Orchid Project shade house. It's very much like a little IKEA shade house. It's pretty big. It's 6 by 8. And it can hold about 2,000 plants in the 50 plug tray size. But it had to have, it can't attach to any existing structure, right? It's going to go to schools, that takes permitting and infrastructure approvals. We can't expect hoses. We can't expect grass or concrete, all that, right? No power, can't expect power. It has to come down if there's a storm, right? In case there's a hurricane, it doesn't become a projectile. And they came up with this. You can assemble this unit with a single Allen wrench in about 3 hours, and you can disassemble it in about 2 hours. It has a rain catchment system on one side, which fills up these containers, which are ballasts, which also hold and weight the system down. It's battery operated, fully automated, and it's a great little system. It actually is at our elementary school down here, just down the way in Cutler Bay. And it's still hanging in there. It's a great little unit. You can grow, you can hang plants, and we're working on trying to get some funding to be able, we just have one of these, it's our prototype. We're trying to get the price point for this one back 8 or 9 years ago was right at about a little under $3,000, which is a little too pricey for us to make it feasible. It's because they did have to machine a couple parts. I guess machining parts gets really expensive really quickly. And it was aluminum too, so it was like ungodly. Like one part cost more than like 3/4, and it's only about this big. It's like where the poles go. And it was nuts just to get those parts made. But we're trying to get the price point of this thing down with outsourcing some of the work to about the $2,000 range. And it could be a great model for home growers even to have a really fully functional shade house for relatively low cost and not a lot of burden on your infrastructure. And again, they do every aspect of the work. So one of the first things we got to think about is the genetics of our plants. As a geneticist myself and a conservation biologist, rightfully so, a lot of our my colleagues were like, hey, Jason, whoa, you're putting 1 million orchids out. What are the genetics of these plants? Are they all coming from a single mother plant source? Is the mother plant inbred? Is it already not a very diverse population to start with? Are you starting essentially with inbreeding? So not only did we answer that question, we did it again with students. This time 15 high school students undertook developing novel microsatellites, which are used to genotype plants for encyclic certipodium, peer-reviewed, published by 15 high school kids. I mean, this is PhD level stuff done with 15, 16-year-olds. A real testament to what students can do if you provide the resources and the training. Really, sky's the limit. We really haven't been able to find anything some of these students that are engaged can't tackle. And again, even our bioreactor system, one of our students from Columbia, who's now at Columbia up in Ivy League, comes down every year and she's like the guru of this system. It's a touchy system, but she's really figured out a lot of the mechanics and of that and the coding aspects of it. And this has led to several peer-reviewed publications over the years, all with kids. So one of the things we're addressing this year, kind of the future direction, is now again talking about this heat island effect. It's something we're very interested in, the county's interested in. We did have a heat officer. I don't know how she They kind of disbanded that department. But again, the theory of this is that cities tend to be much hotter and drier than the adjacent natural areas or green spaces. That's due to the amount of concrete typically, which traps heat in these cities. And I have been seeing this happen over my 25 years in Miami, watching these big, beautiful clouds rolling from Kendall. They make it to like Coral Gable and shrivel up when they get to Brickell. And I live on South Beach. They never really make it to South Beach anymore, which is terrifying. And that's a lot due to this latent heat that's trapped in these cities. So immediately we had to think, okay, this is going to change what we can grow and how we grow. You couple that with the other news that happened a few years ago where we were elevated to 11A growth zone. When I moved here in 99, we were still 9A. That's how rapid. So we are now truly in a tropical plant hardiness zone. So how are plants going to respond, particularly for us, how are orchids going to respond, right? If they're the most sensitive, we can learn a lot from these orchids and the plant responses, and we can apply that to things like trees and shrubs and all the other stuff, right? And so this was really a shocker for us. So we began thinking about that. And again, our updated climate model, you can see we have now tropical rainforest, monsoon, and savanna, all kind of in the southern Florida area. And our days over 90 also are just out of control. I don't remember seeing days over 90. This is the projected. I think we had 70 days roughly, somebody correct me, last year or so, over 90. I mean, there was a handful when I moved here in the late 90s. So it's happening now, and it's human cause. This is things that these students have to think about. It's kind of the situation they're going to be left with, and part of this Caribbean floristic inventory. With that said, we now have been looking at Caribbean orchids. So these are orchids that originate from that 11A hardiness zone, and comparing them to orchids that are originating in 9A, aka our Florida population and species. Things like Guarianthe, or formerly Cattleya, Guatemalensis, for instance, is a great one. Loaded GZI, Beringiana. These are all ones we're finding that are quite hardy. Browtonia, another really important genus from the Caribbean. Surprisingly, Browtonia does not occur in South Florida, but I think it will as we have less and less of these cold events that kind of keep these Caribbean species at bay. These seeds blow over all the time. I'm sure they're just not germinating, or they're fading out before they can establish and be noticed. But also what's great about Browtonia is some of these species, particularly Sanguiniae, which is in Jamaica, grow like right on the rocky coast. I mean, they're within the salt splash of the ocean. So these are going to be really, really important species for our coastal communities, right? Because they're going to tolerate, think Brickell, where that wind's just coming right off the ocean. The pillars of death at the Frost Science Museum, I call them. You know, those pillars that they all fried, the ferns fried from the salt inundation. These type of orchids are great. Brassivola nodosa, the Brassivola genus. Hardy, flowers all year, fragrant, grow in full sun. These are winners. Our favorite is still Myrmecophila, or formerly Schomburgkia. These are like scorched earth orchids. I mean, you could put this on your hottest south-facing palm and it will root on like a weed. And they're absolutely gorgeous. And Lealia is another group. So these are the things we're looking at in the future, and we've been rolling these out for 2 or 3 years in the research of the Million Orchid Project in schools. And I won't, again, this still made it in, but you can see these are kind of our Caribbean species on the end. We tried out this year, and they did outperform our native 9A species in terms of survivorship. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons for this. I guess I couldn't, but, you know, there's a lot of reasons, but not only the students have to deal with vandalism, theft, facilities, the weed whacker guy, and iguanas, but what we did find from some of those data that we're getting back is hardwoods seem to be much better than palms for our native orchids in general. Shade and cooler makes a lot of sense. Even if they're a full sun orchid, they still like a little relief, particularly from those afternoon hours of direct sun. Branches and crotches tend to be better than trunks. So even the placement in cardinal direction students were trying to identify, all that data comes back and feeds us when we're working in the communities, and our survivorship goes up by the data driven by kids, right? And now the labs are everywhere, and particularly with the schools as being the major component we started with. I'm happy to say FIU, all the Miami-Dade campuses now have the Million Orchid Project in some aspect, either a lab, a full lab commitment, or a greenhouse situation, or planting and collecting data. FAU at Pine Jog are growing orchids, particularly some of those West Palm populations we don't get. And even outside the state of Florida, 5 years ago, we worked on a grant with my lab at the Smithsonian, and we were able to get funds to sponsor 7 schools in the DC metropolitan area. Prince George's, Washington D.C. proper, using our classroom curriculum, the orchids in the classroom, inserting your local native orchid. In that case, these are ground orchids up there, things like the cypripediums, the lady slippers, and the Goodyear, the little evergreen orchids. And it was a lot of fun. The kids had a blast, and we've been able to get refunded again, despite all the issues with the feds, and they're having a lot of fun with it. Unfortunately, they don't behave like our tropical orchids. They're very slow growing in comparison, so maybe some of these species take 2-3 years in the laboratory before they can even go to a greenhouse. But the students do get to put them in the refrigerator, which is cool, and they have a lot of fun with that and pull them out in the springtime. And of course, this is now in, I don't think I have that, but we're now in Dominican Republic as lab, Jamaica. We're working on the hurricane, that little setback for August. Cayman Islands we're working with, Turks and Caicos soon. We worked with Kew Gardens in Kerala, India, of all places, and working with folks in Australia to potentially have a few schools in Australia. So the model's reproducible. Getting kids into growing orchids in classrooms is a lot of fun, and it's productive, and it's actually quite, we're seeing some really good results from it. So the schools play a major role, but again, I have to talk about our public and private partners. This isn't even close to our list. I just put some of our first. I think we're close to over 100 public and private partners. Currently, we're talking pretty much every major municipality, with the exception of a handful, now have commitments, some of which are multi-year phase plans. So they're actually going into the commissioners and actually getting the money earmarked for orchids in their landscapes, which is pretty darn amazing. Places like Coral Gables, obviously Miracle Miles, Flooded, the Grove, Commodore. You'll see all the Bahamian orchids in Commodore and the Florida orchids. But also, again, universities, every major hospital complex. We actually just signed on with every Jackson campus and every Baptist campus is now fully in and funding this work. And University of Miami too, Sylvester. We'll be doing a big orchid garden there very soon. Condo associations, retirement communities, still our best. Survivorship's like 99% of the retirement communities. My ladies with their squirt bottle, I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's just insane to see how big their plants are compared to some of our other sites. Cruise lines, you name it, everyone's getting in on the action and help further our research with all the proceeds driving more and more orchids in the community. And we have a lot of fun. I always show this picture because I just think it's so cool that the gentleman here next to our director is John Lummis IV. The name Lummis, ring a bell for any people from Miami? Yeah, so this is actually the great-grandson of John Lummis, who actually, again, with Fisher, were the ones who developed most of what is Miami Beach in Miami. So in other words, they bulldozed all the orchids down at some point. And so his son, who actually lives in Arkansas of all places, but with the University of Florida, as you can see, McDavid, so I forgive him for it. Actually caught wind of the program, and his foundation actually donated funds to plant orchids back in their namesake parks, including South Point Park on Miami Beach. And we have a lot of fun. Actually, they love it so much that his wife and his kids come down every year and plant with us for like 2 weeks out of the year. It's kind of like part of their family vacation, which is pretty wild. And it's been amazing to see them grow up from like 5 to now like 12 years old. But this is the kind of thing that I think, this type of, the orchids are really flashy, they're charismatic, and they really capture people's attentions and get them involved in conservation. We do orchid distributions throughout the region. This is somewhere in Coral Gables probably. The city wants to, anyone who had an ID from Coral Gables got an orchid funded by the city. And big planting events. I think Royal Caribbean sponsored this one. We had 2,000 people planting that day, and we planted about 3,000 orchids in a couple hours. That's crazy impact. And the orchids look really good. I actually visited, there's a school on this kind of green space, and the orchids look really good. Even the cow ones were surviving. And the mayors get involved, obviously the photo ops are important. But at the end of the day, getting orchids in the community not only provides ownership, but also a sense of security, right? Because people now know the value of them and that they're going in their community, so they're more likely to keep eyes on them, provide feedback, and also make sure, that they're taken care of in some regard. Oh, sorry. And this is Middle US, one of all places. And we also do pop-ups because people love the Orchid Lab work. And I think there's some vacant real estate on think it was on Miracle Mile, and one of the developers was like, man, can you just make this vacant store until we lease it, look like the lab? And sure enough, it was a great way to communicate what we're doing. And this is what we're seeing now. Orchids all over the place. This was cypress, it's kind of cheating, but they love the cypress. There's downtown Doral, not Doral, this is Design District. This is our urbanmost site. And the last census we did, we had about 4,000 orchids, I counted, right in front of the Gucci building of all places. And sure enough, there's a cigar orchid growing in downtown Miami for the first time in probably 100 years. And they look great. Hopefully these will flower this year. If we have a flowering cigar orchid in urban Miami, it'll be like the ghost orchid. It's so rare and difficult to actually even establish back in the wild. It's going to be a big deal. And our Million Orchid, this one's chewed up a little, but I couldn't believe how giant this was. So this is the one, there's 40 plants left in the Everglades. This was at a school, and I think we were there for STEM lab, and she's like, oh, you gotta check out the orchid we did from last year. I'm like, well, which one is it? I thought it was probably one of the butterfly orchids, and she's like, I don't know, you're gonna have to come tell me. And I looked, I was like, are you kidding me? It's like the champion trichocentrum, and it already flowered twice. I couldn't believe it. And just how rare these are to have them growing in the schoolyards is pretty amazing. The orchid you guys got, the Oncidium, is performing amazing in just landscape beds. Tough little orchid, didn't matter the soil type. You plant that in the ground and it takes off. I think this is like a Biltmore pool of all places. And we got flowers now. So for the last 3 years, we've been seeing mass flowering of these plants. Again, there's kind of these checklists that we have to check off for a sustainable population. It's one thing just to plant them out if they never first live, but if they don't reproduce, then it's not real conservation, right? You have to have the population must be sustainable on its own. So the big question was, can we keep them alive to flower? And we've been seeing that now for 3 years. The next is, will they set fruit? aka, will they be pollinated, right? We don't know. Are the pollinators absent from the urban environment? These were all question marks when we started the program. Really a natural experiment. This is, I think, Miracle Mile. There's like tons of Encyclias. The Encyclias are amazing on Miracle Mile now. Bufianas are blooming now, the little dollar orchids. Epidendrum nocturnums we're finding in bloom. These sell. But sure enough, we're getting pictures back from schools of pollinators. So our pine pink, our little ground orchid being pollinated by, this one actually, you can't see it from this picture, but assured, they have videos, they have bees. But pollinators are getting in, and we're finding, the last couple of years, seed set, fruit set. Huge, major achievement for the program. These things are being pollinated in the urban matrix, and you can see the capsules. This one set several capsules, and we're finding that pretty much across all sites. The pollinators are around. But remember, what's the other thing we talked about in the very beginning? These seeds are different. They require fungi, right? So that was the thing we were most worried about for myself, because I studied that, is do the urban environments host the same fungus, right? Because you think fungus wants cool, wet, damp, shady maybe. The opposite of a city with the urban heat island effect. Sure enough, last year we found volunteers. This was like in the middle of US 1, I was screaming like a madman, so I had the cops call me. We've been finding volunteers. Plants are symbiotically germinating with the mycorrhiza in the cities, and that means we can complete the circle of life. And actually my graduate student, former graduate student, she now graduated, get this manuscript out very soon. She sampled all the bark of a lot of host trees all through the city and the roots of the orchids, and we actually found the exact same fungus that I had identified in the wild. So, and it was pretty much on every host tree, so it's ubiquitous, which is huge. It's going to be a really important paper because we don't think that mycorrhiza, that fungal component, is going to limit the ability for these things to establish. There'll be other factors not related to the fungus. So big, very encouraging. So, how do we track all these orchids long term? We got an app for that, again, working with other students, this time at FIU, and they designed our first app, the Orchid Tracker. It right now is in beta. We actually, the student graduated, so now we've gone to a private designer who's now working on the 2.0 version. I don't know anything about apps, this is where I get lost, but essentially, my understanding is you have to break these things in order to make them better. So they want it to be like kind of overwhelmed by people and users, and then they tweak it to make it more friendly, or I don't know. But they're working on a new one, which is going to be even better than this one. It's going to have a dashboard where you can compare schools, and the students can use it to do data analysis between other units, other sites throughout the city. But essentially how it works, you get the phone, you pop up the map, tells you where all the orchids are in the region. You get to the site, the compass will direct you to a plot or a tree. If it's ground orchid, it'll be a plot, and you're going to find this little QR sign. You zap it with your phone, and you become the citizen scientist. And anyone in the community can do this. It'll ask you, is it dead? Is it alive? Has it been stolen? Does it have flowers? Do you see seed capsules? And depending on your level of expertise, you can get the number of stems, pseudobolts, root attachment. Really important data for us. Predation with iguanas is another one we're looking at. So this is another way, another layer to get everyone involved. Even if you don't have a green thumb, you can still go out and hunt orchids in the city and help us drive this big data pool that we're going to be doing in this. So to wrap up, we started the program back in 2013. We've overcome, we've done nearly 700,000, actually it's a little bit dated, and close to 400 locations as of this year, the 2025 data. Each year we add species, we add our footprint, our coverage increases, and we learn a lot. We've overcome, again, Irma, which was a major catastrophe. We lost all the shade houses down in Montgomery, and a pandemic, which obviously was another major setback. But we've kept chugging away. We're now in our 13th year, more or less, from when our first seeds were dropped. We hope to eclipse that million mark within the next couple of years, and then maybe a billion, and well beyond the footprint of Florida. We hope to have this incorporated all around the world and in every state. And as long as we have the enthusiasm of you guys, and keep it going. So just to kind of finish up, you can get orchids for your backyard conservation, we call it. Something we did during COVID is create little kits, or you can buy individual plants, or you can come to the Fairchild show in March. We're going to have a lot of the natives in 4-inch size for the first time. We're actually setting aside orchids, even though it's hard to keep up with the demand. We're going to set aside a few to get big and flowering size. You can go onto our line, you can shop at Fairchild, and we'll deliver or ship to you wherever you're at. I think now we have a shipping department, so we ship everywhere but Hawaii. We can get you some native Florida orchids and the host of the Caribbean line for your landscapes. So you can really have plants really focusing on the ones you can grow outside of your landscapes. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take a few questions.